So as you see, this is a very general question. How do we analyze a literary text? And if we have to go by, hundreds of years of criticism, there are so many answers to this question, right? And it is a very, very complex, answer that we'll eventually find. But what I want to do today is to make you sort of take a step back, right? Now, many of you, when you sort of approach a literary text, right? And we'll also talk about what we mean by literary text in a minute. But when you approach a literary text, you think about, let's say, reading up a little bit on it, reading up on the context, trying to understand it a little more. And then perhaps you gather the confidence to comment on it, right? However, what ends up happening frequently, especially in early undergrad, is that you may feel a bit intimidated, by the critical literature. You feel that, you're not qualified enough to understand a lot of things. There are so many disciplines to read, so many books to read. So then how do you go about it? So we'll take a step back. And for this workshop, we'll imagine that we are all beginners, right? And I think that's a very useful exercise. So it's an exercise in unlearning. So let's sort of keep aside what we know, about the various theories that we have, read over time. There are words like post-colonial, Marxist, cultural materialist. Let's keep them aside. And let's sort of try to instead take baby steps into literary analysis and try to understand the fundamentals of it. So that's what we'll try to do today, right? Now, when we say literary text, there are two ways we understand it, right? So one way is something that is already called literature. So you go to a bookstore and you see that, okay, there is a shelf which has literary fiction written on it. And you're like, okay, this is literary fiction, that's nonfiction. So this is literary. The publisher has called it literary. Or and in a university, you come and you have a literature syllabus, right? And in the literature syllabus, you have literary texts. So one way of understanding is something that has been called literary by an institution, whether it's a publisher, whether it's a university, whether it's a literary critic, and so on and so forth. The other way to understand it is by seeking the literary. You're trying to find the literary in any text that you're reading. What does that mean? That means that whenever you read anything that has to do with language and words, including, let's say, speech, right? What I'm saying right now, it's not just, functional, right? It's not that I'll give you an instruction that turn off your cameras or turn on your cameras. You don't only register the meaning of that, you're registering a tone. You feel like, okay, that was too harsh. Why is he sort of, shouting at us? Why is he ordering us? Right? So the literary is what, gives sort of that emotional and social understanding of language, right? And so literary analysis in that sense is sort of seeking the social and emotional aspects in language, right? So we'll start with that basic definition, but before we proceed, we'll do a short word association exercise. So let's do this now. What's the first word or phrase that comes to your mind when you think of analysis? Just the word analysis. So can you put it down on chat? Like whatever, the first word. Process, deconstruction, detail, thinking, interpretation, evaluate, technical, meaning, breaking down, magnifying, critique, clarity, research. Okay, so the words that you have provided here, analysis, right? This doesn't have to do with just a literary text, right? So when we think of analysis, we can be analyzing anything. We can be analyzing, this session, right? So if we have to think of the structure of this session, we'll think, okay, it's divided into maybe 4 parts, right? If we have to think of, let's say, details, we'll say, okay, what are the different details in this class or in this workshop? We have the speaker, we have the participants, some of them have their videos on, some of them have their videos off, we have the chat box. Now, all of this, right, is what we'll call mental processes or activities. Now, this applies to anything at all. This applies to whether we are cooking, whether we are dancing, whether we are writing or whether we are, participating in this classroom, in this workshop, right? So one way to think about analysis is something that is a mental or cognitive activity, right? Cognitive has to do with cognition, how you think. But what if we add the word literary to it? So rather than now thinking of just analysis in the sense of, a set of mental activities applying to everything, what if we say literary analysis? What happens? Can you put down the first thoughts? Analysis of text. Okay. But just like you were saying, observation, it's something you're doing. So what are you doing with literary analysis? Okay, processing a sentence, that's more specific. Reading is a very useful word, right? Reading between the lines. Comprehension, and here you're comprehending words in particular. Shijila has an interesting input, exploring, enjoying the way an idea is communicated. Shijila, would you like to tell us a little bit about that? What do you mean by enjoying the way an idea is communicated? Locating the text in a social, political, cultural context. Critical interpretation. Okay, now, what is being communicated? Okay, so I think that as soon as we add the word literary before analysis, we are trying to think of, okay, all of these things we thought about, observation, interpretation, right? Examination, breaking down, meaning making, how all of these sort of mental activities now applies to something linguistic, right? And as soon as you apply to something linguistic, you are then thinking of things like, okay, it's not just observing language, but observing language to think of the context behind it, right? Somebody said grasping the literary aspects. So literary aspects, let's say if I interpret it as some of the emotional aspects of it, right? So you are observing language or breaking down or examining language to explore the emotional aspects of it, right? So how do we do that? And that is precisely what we'll talk about in this workshop. Now, one of the things I also want to comment on right now is that when you've given your sort of responses, you see that when I asked you what does analysis mean, you gave me very specific words. As soon as I said, what does literary analysis mean? You are saying things like reading the fictional works in a certain way, right? But there is a slightly, there's some imprecision here also, right? You can't say it so specifically. So can we get more specific? So that is also going to be one of our objectives. Now, before we sort of start actually reading texts and thinking of, analyzing a literary text, for many undergraduate students, right? And, my PhD was actually in, in Delhi, and I talked to lots of undergraduate students in English departments to try to understand, okay, what were their, various struggles, what did they not understand or comprehend, in their sort of class everyday education. And this was, of course, one of the issues that came up, that what do we mean by critical analysis? Now, typically what will happen is you will be asked to critically analyze a text in an exam or an assignment, right? And let's say there is one character who's sort of interested in this question, right? Is analysis learned just by reading more? How exactly do I need to present? And I'm sure these are questions all of you have, that what is it that I need to do in order to get better at analysis? But what ends up happening frequently is that if you don't think of the fundamentals, you end up performing analysis in a slightly, let's say, ungrounded or insincere manner, right? You're not quite sure of what you're doing, but you're trying to, let's say, just imitate what you think is the correct thing to do, right? So this is, of course, a very cynical point of view, and I hope none of you are cynical like this character. who's saying that, I just try to imitate the language of critical essays, sprinkled in some jargon and some big names. And taking from there, um, let's sort of think of what are some of the choices we make sometimes. And even I've made it as an undergrad student. So one thing I used to do is that use jargon without clearly understanding the concepts, right? So I would, think that, okay, this is what is expected of me. So when I'm asked to analyze a literary text, I should use these big words. I should say that I want to problematize the text, but I don't know what that means. What does problematizing the text mean? Or let's say I would say that, using the lens of, second wave feminism, but I'm not very clear. I haven't read enough in that field to understand, right? Another thing that happens frequently is using vague or imprecise language, right? So you will say things like, in a certain way, some things, right? You're never able to exactly capture a specific detail when you're writing. This happens a lot where you feel, let's say, a pressure to use lots of quotes or ideas from critics or theorists, right? But not necessarily in a manner that is important or pertinent. Sometimes we just want to fill our pages with a lot of critics' names because, we think that will make the text sound more important, right? And of course, disconnected incoherent phrasing. And the previous session was on coherence. So I hope that there's more insight about this area. But frequently we find that, one sentence is not following the next. Or we find that in an argument, the reasons are not supporting, what we are trying to prove or justify, right? Now, let's take a minute now. And, before we move on, I want you to think about what have been some of the struggles you have faced, right? So while presenting your analysis of a text in an exam or assignment, what have been some of the struggles you have faced? And it would be great if you can also speak. So once you have thought about it, maybe raise your hand, and others can also put it down on chat. So take 30 seconds, think about it. So Subir, this question about, can there be a situation where precision is difficult to achieve? So let's take these questions at the end of the session, right? So just stack up your questions and we can sort of discuss them towards the end of the session.
Would you like us to filter the questions, the responses, Sayan?
Yeah, so could you just read them out?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so Aditi is saying I take a lot of time to start writing, but once I start, it happens. Okay. In terms of difficulty, how to connect the paras and like how to conclude in the end. Sanskriti says not having much background knowledge about the text's social context. Kritika has to say, to form, she faces trouble in forming original thoughts about the text. Word limit. Zenith says dividing answer into sections and paragraphs.
Okay. After a certain point, it becomes too far-fetched. That's a very interesting statement, Gopal. And what do we do to avoid that it's far-fetched? Because frequently we think we are just imagining, we are just speculating, right? We have two opinions on, whether it has to be original or not. Some of you may feel anxious, okay, this is not original, this is too derivative. But what ends up happening is that if we are just imitating another person's speech or text, then there's a greater chance of it being derivative. What we want to get at is being able to form our opinions and judgments on our own. And of course, reading texts to supplement them and enhance them and develop them. Sonal has asked a very interesting question. Sometimes I feel that a minor detail was born simply out of author's boredom or hurry. Should I really consider everything important? I think that the answer is that if the detail is connected to a larger theme that you notice, right, then it may be important. So it also becomes a sort of subjective choice. All right, so now it's good to sort of spell out what your struggles are. Now, from what I notice, some of your struggles are with structuring, right? Now, structuring has to do with writing, and that is it sort of, it will take its own workshop, and I won't go into like how do you exactly structure an analysis, but I want to talk about the starting points, because if your starting point is unstructured, then how you write your analysis also ends up being unstructured. The second thing I'll talk about is I'll also talk about the idea of argumentation. And the way in which you get better at structuring and connecting ideas is also by understanding how an argument works. So that's something we'll do towards the end of the session, right? All right. So let's sort of keep these thoughts in mind, because we want to learn to address them, and let's see if the approach that I have to offer helps address some of these struggles. Now, this is in fact, I've sort of typed it out. This is from a study that was done in France, in fact. And these, so, what happened is a bunch of, scholars, and Christian Baudelaire being one, they studied undergraduate exam sheets. And they sort of, and this is for a French sociology, class. And they studied sort of undergraduate exam sheets and tried to see what are some of these choices students make in their language. Now, my argument is that if you are not getting your basics right, and if you're not able to sort of, analyze by paying close attention to the text, it's possible that you have a slightly more vaguer understanding of the text, which then comes out in the vagueness of your language. And we'll take Subir's question also, that sometimes you can't, necessarily be very precise. But we are talking about how your grounding itself is vague, right? And this you will see in how language is being used. So these are some of the problems that were pointed out. The use of indefinite expressions. It is said, some people believe. You're never saying who is saying it. Who are the people who believe, right? Attenuations means, reducing the clarity of something. So which imply that the contrary proposition is not impossible, and transfer to the examiner the task of excluding any consideration which would actually introduce doubt. So when you say things like sufficiently, in general, often, sometimes, in a way, nearly all philosophers have thought that. The question is, are you taking accountability for this statement, right? Do you actually know that this happens in general? Or it's just a linguistic habit that you have? Perhaps a kind of tension. So these are sort of, timid approximations like, okay, maybe, I'm not sure. False particularization, it means it's false because you can also spell out what society you're talking about. So when you say a specific society, you're not exactly saying which society it is. And sometimes, you may be talking about multiple societies, but using the phrase a specific society. Now, the problem is not just with the language. You can say a specific society, but the idea is you have to know what that specific is, right? Now, in order to do that, now let's sort of begin our reading exercises. And as I mentioned right at the beginning, it's important to take a few steps back, right? So imagine you are a student in an undergraduate institution. You have not been exposed to jargon, to texts, to criticism. You have been exposed to language. You have picked up a book, right? And all you are doing now is you are reading the sentences And by reading the sentences, you're trying to understand larger social and emotional meanings that you can associate with the text. So how to do that? Now, just to sort of, reinforce the spirit of what we are doing, our approach is not a formula-based approach, right? And here, we are taking actually an example from mathematics. Although, you might say that maths is so different from literature. Why use this example? It's because, one of the most powerful romantic, books of analysis I have read is by a mathematician called Paul Lockhart, right? Lockhart, Paul Lockhart. And he has written this very nice book, a nice essay called A Mathematician's Lament. And he's talking as a mathematician who is sad that we approach analysis through formulas, right? So think of how you have learned maths in school, right? You have, let's say you have been taught, let's say how ABC is a right angle triangle, ABC is a right angle. And in order to teach you that, first, the teacher has told you, okay, there are 3 points in a triangle, A, B, and C. It's within a semicircle. They've given you a proof, given you reasons, you mugged it up. And then anytime somebody asks you, why is ABC a right angle? You will, from memory, you will reproduce this formula. But Paul Lockhart says, what if we suspend all of this, right? And let's just start with the shape. Let's not give it any sort of label. Let's not give it any identity, but let's use our intuitions, right? What we already know and sense. Let's use our imagination, right? Of course, there's a risk of making it far-fetched, but let's not be afraid of taking that risk, right? Whether it's far-fetched or not will have to be ultimately corroborated or verified. We'll have to read up eventually to understand if it's far-fetched. But let's use our imagination and let's introspect, right? So one example he uses is that, he says that let's draw a triangle inside a semicircle and let's kind of, start pulling the lines. Let's connect it to different points of the semicircle. Let's see what happens, right? So we are going to sort of work in the same spirit. We are going to use our intuitions, our imagination, and work through sentences. So let's start with one of the basic elements of a text, right? When we say a text, and especially literary text, we are referring to a very broad and complex thing, right? It has hundreds and thousands of sentences and words, right? But can we just start with the basic element, which is a sentence, and take it from there and slowly scale it up, right? So we're going to take the sentence, which many of you would be familiar with, might be familiar with. For those who are not, it doesn't matter. Because it doesn't matter if you know the sentence or not, if you have read the sentence or not before. What matters is how do we read the sentence. Now, what we're going to do now, and I'm going to give you like, a minute to do this. I want you to go through each part of the sentence, and to sort of help you see the sentence a little differently, I have put it like this, right? I have actually sort of broken down the sentence in separate lines, almost, you can think of it as a poem now almost. But these are all different elements of the sentence, right? So we have Mr. and Mrs. Dursley. Yeah, so we have Mr. and Mrs. Dursley. We have the word off. We have number 4 Privet Drive. We're proud to say that they were perfectly normal. Thank you very much. Now, when you read it together, you read it, Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say they were perfectly normal. Thank you very much. When you sort of listen to the sentence, okay, maybe there's some meaning, some vague, let's say, some broad or vague sort of association that you find that, okay, these people, they live in this area, Privet Drive. They're proud of the fact they're normal. Okay, those are the associations you get. But we want to go deeper. And we want to go deeper just by looking at the sentence. Now, the way in which I would encourage you to do this is by asking a question. The first question to ask is the what question, right? So what are the different elements of the sentence? So let's think of Mr. and Mrs. Dursley. So what is this? We can say this is the subject of the sentence. Suppose, you don't know these terms, subject, predicate, object. They're characters, right? They're people. So we start with the what, right? Mr. and Mrs. Dursley. But the next question we want to get to is the how and why, right? Uh, we will now ask the question, and this is where we are going to use our imagination. Why has the author written Mr. and Mrs. Dursley and not, let's say, Robert and Jane, right? They could have had those names. The author hasn't spelled out their names, but have written them as Mr. and Mrs. Dursley. Does this give us any information? So what would be your response? You think there's a difference between Mr. and Mrs. Dursley? So Kuntal, you have said prestige. Liam, you have said middle class or upper class. They're an old-fashioned couple like from the 50s. Okay. They want to focus on the fact that they're married. Okay, interesting, right? Just by looking at that they're Mr. and Mrs. Dursley and not X and Y, two separate names, we are already able to interpret certain things. So one, we think of them as a married couple, right? So that's a basic thing that we can obviously predict. That's not far-fetched at all. Two members of a family, right? There could be 10 members, 2 members are represented, right? Okay, that's also another thing we interpret. There's a formal feel that Mr. and Mrs. Dursley. It could have been, let's say, Jane Dursley and Robert Dursley, but Mr. and Mrs. Dursley might have a formal feel, right? Gopal has said something interesting. They're an old-fashioned couple, like from the 50s. Now, this is interesting because we don't have any information from just this phrase, Mr. and Mrs. Dursley, to know if they're old-fashioned, if they're from the 50s or they're young, right? So Gopal, maybe you've read this book, but suppose you haven't read this book, would you still say that? Liam has said middle class or upper class, but just from Mr. and Mrs. Dursley, can we say they're middle class or upper class? Maybe we can say that from some other information. We'll get there. So what do we have? We have Mr. and Mrs. Dursley. We know that, okay, married. There is a formal presentation of their identity, right? What about the surname Dursley? What do you get from that? Any, like, do you think of who would be Dursley? Like, you know, and we have people from different countries here also. But when you hear the surname Mr. Dursley, okay, you're thinking British, English. Could they be Indian? I would say, yeah, why not? They could be Indian, right? So then would you associate it with cultural identity, with religious identity? Girl's surname is not covered probably. Okay. So this is also interesting that, you know, Mrs. Dursley, I mean, if it's sort of a patriarchal arrangement where Mrs. Dursley is married to Mr. Dursley, Mrs. Dursley may have given up her, you know, maiden name, right? So that gives you a sense of, let's say, also the social codes and norms that operate in marriage. But what we can say is that, okay, this could be Western. This could also be non-Western, but you typically don't associate it with non-Christian. You would think maybe this is a Christian surname. But anyway, so those are some sort of informational points you sort of put down that you think that, okay, married, maybe Western, maybe Christian, formal, you know, social norms of marriage are operating. Now let's move to the next word. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley off. Number 4 Privet Drive. Now what we're interested in is off, right? So Rosemary said Dursley is a common name in Cambridgeshire, England. And this is something you will find then from your research, but your intuition is already telling you that perhaps this is the case. And then the research, let's say, verifies it. Or sometimes you don't know at all. You may be completely mistaken and then the research will correct you. But let's come to off. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley off. Number 4 Privet Drive. Now, I want to sort of ask a question here. So if I ask the question, what is off? You would say a preposition, right? If you don't, let's say, know, you know, what a preposition is, you would say off is connecting Mr. and Mrs. Dursley, who are characters, with an address, number 4 Privet Drive. Off is a connector. right? So when we say Mr. and Mrs. Dursley off, number 4 Privet Drive, we are now asking the question, why is off being used? Now, think about when we talk about where we live. Somebody asks you, where do you live? Right? I'll say, okay, my name is Sayan Chaudhuri. My address is XYZ, right? So I live in a neighborhood called Salt Lake, right? So I would say I'm Sayan Chaudhuri, living in Salt Lake, right? Would I say I'm Sayan Chaudhuri of Salt Lake, right? You would use the word of to refer to belonging. Yes, you would refer to belonging. Now the question you're asking is, of means belonging, but why is there a belonging to an address, to a house? Because we think of belonging referring to, let's say, culture, to, let's say, nationality, right? You would say, I am Shayon, from India, I am of Indian origin, right? Why do you think the belonging is connected to the address? They are showing off, okay. Their identity is associated with the address. That's very good. There could be two couples bearing the same surname. This is a very interesting point, actually. So technically, psychologically, what if like Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive, there's a Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 5 Privet Drive. So you're sort of distinguishing yourself. Okay, Advika said it positions the narrator with respect to the Dursleys. This is an interesting point. Advika, could you explain it?
Yeah, it's like a neighbor telling you about another neighbor. These people belong to that house, and this kind of a sentence arrangement would be more appropriate there. So it seems like the narrator is someone who lives close by and is looking on and telling you the story.
Okay, that's an interesting point. So it feels like, the narrator is looking on, is an onlooker, right? And telling you the story. But at the same time, we don't have enough information yet from the sentence to know whether that's the case. But we can keep that in mind, right? But what we can say more concretely is that their identity is associated with the house, right? With their address. And we want to understand now, why is it that their identity is associated with the house? Does it have to do with status, as some people are saying? Does it have to do, yes, does it have to do with social class? Now to think of that more, let's move to the next part. Number 4, Privet Drive. Now let's think of this a little more. Now, if I ask the what question, what is number 4 Privet Drive? You would say that, setting, right? Address. But why Privet Drive? Also, why number 4? But I'm asking the question that why Privet Drive? Is Privet Drive indicating something? Is Privet Drive, for example, like if I have to use examples, like is Privet Drive different from Privet Lane? Is different from, to use a very Indian term, different from, let's say, Malkagan Chowk, Privet Chowk, right? Is there a difference? Okay, so Liam is saying it sounds like a posh locality. Okay, anything else? So do you think we can speculate on anything from just this address, Privet Drive? Now, perhaps not, but what we can keep in mind here is that road names or street names are actually not that neutral. Street names also happen in relation to, class positions frequently, right? And you look around you, you sort of, walk down the streets and think of, what are the titles and names of your streets. And you'll begin to realize that, oh, maybe there are these class and caste sort of hierarchies operating in how streets are named also. So Privet Drive could be a middle class neighborhood, could be a posh neighborhood. Ashima has said they're proud owners of the house. That's another sense of, off, right? Tanushi has said sentence ends quickly just after a one-line information. Okay, so Tanushi, we'll come to that. We'll come to the last part. Tarun has said near sea. This is interesting. You think of a drive near a sea, but let's see if that's the case or not. Now let's move to the next part. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal. Were proud to say that they were perfectly normal. What are the associations from this? So if I have to, again, ask the what question, I would say were proud to say that indicates action. This is the first time you get a sense of an action, a verb. They're proud. And what constitutes the action? They were perfectly normal. They want to say that they're perfectly normal. But why? So Gopal has said pride and entitlement. They want to portray something specifically. This is important, right? It's like they want to emphasize this, that they were perfectly normal. And also notice the word perfectly. Perfectly here, it could have been they were normal. But they were perfectly normal is giving a sense of how they probably want to distinguish themselves a little from what is abnormal, right? So if I may be a little speculative, I can think that maybe psychologically they're a bit defensive, right? It's possible. They're proud to say that they were perfectly normal. So there are other sort of options coming. So Hadia said setting the ground for the actions to follow. So anticipation, right? Liam is saying snobbish. This is actually very good. That they were proud to say they're perfectly normal. There's a sense of bragging that, we are very normal, Maybe it has to do with class norms, with class values in their neighborhood, right? They don't want to be abnormal and seen as odd or seen as sort of dipping in class status. They're normal. They're like everybody else, right? They don't trouble anybody. They're distancing themselves from those they're not considering normal. And finally, let's move to the last part. Thank you very much. What role do you think this plays? Thank you very much. End of discussion, closing the conversation. But if I have to now understand, what is this? What is thank you very much? One way I could do it is by trying to understand what is the function of thank you very much. What is the role it's playing? Suppose I say, Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say they were perfectly normal. Hell yes. Does it play a similar function? It does, right? Now, this is what we call an intensifier. Now, we are not getting into the grammatical technicality of it, but we are reinforcing, we are emphasizing, thank you very much. It's not enough to say they were perfectly normal. They want to say, thank you very much. Mahima said sarcasm, all right? Shutting down arguments of abnormality. So you're closing the conversation, shutting down arguments. As soon as you thank you very much, it's over, right? There's no space for you to even question me. Politeness, thank you very much is a polite term, but this is like a politeness that is combined with an assertion, right? Now, these are things that we have thought about just by reading each part of the sentence, step by step. Let's try to put it together now. Now, from here, we are now beginning to anticipate social and emotional associations. And we are beginning to anticipate how this one sentence can be connected to larger understandings of society. How do we contextualize this text, in society? So as we discussed, so these are some things I have written down. Of course, you pointed out many more things. So married, connected identity, maybe Western Christian surname. As Rosemary said, this is something we can now verify by looking at, surnames in, a certain part of Britain. Of, it's the preposition, but it's also talking about belonging, association of identity. Number 4, Privet Drive. So it's an urban middle-class landscape, maybe. You're announcing or bragging that, they're perfectly normal. This may show like a defensive psychology. And thank you very much. It's an abrupt ending. It's surface politeness. Perhaps it's also seeking acceptance, right? You want people to sort of just know that, you are perfectly normal. Now, just by asking a set of questions, we were able to do this, right? And what I want to now show you is we'll zoom out. And we'll think of what are these questions that we need to ask. Now, there are three questions that I've sort of put down here for you. And these three questions can sort of be the guidelines for you. So what are the different elements, features you notice in the sentence? So that's the first. What is it? We don't want to be ungrounded. We don't want to be vague, right? So we have to first say, what is it? What is this part of the sentence? Is it the subject? Is it the setting? Is it the character? What is the choice of word? Is it a metaphor? Is it a simile? Let's label it first. Number two, we are also asking how and why are these elements being used? And this is where we start getting into the social, psychological, cultural understandings. Now, of course, we can now further our research on it, but we already have some inklings. It's almost like you're a detective, you have some clues, right? And finally, we are also thinking of what are your biases when you read the sentence. So all of you, you're giving separate answers. Think of it. And you're giving separate answers because you have separate biases. And that's important to keep in mind because your bias is rooted in your experience, your understanding. So it's important to also recognize that and look at how other people are responding and compare your bias with others also, right? So these would be, let's say, the three starting questions to start reading a sentence. And by reading a sentence, we anticipate larger literary analysis. Now, let's quickly do this exercise and then we'll take like a short break. Keeping the previous three questions in mind, jot down your observations of the different elements of the following sentence, right? It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. This is a very famous sentence from, a novel that some of you have read, I'm sure. But I want you to now, just as I showed you, I want you to now think of the sentence, through separate parts of the sentence. You can further break it down, right? You can, it is a truth. You can treat it as one section. So truth is the subject here, right? What is the truth? That a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. What are the verbs here? Acknowledged, possession, right? So these are some things you can notice, but tell me what are the various associations? So take, 2 minutes. And what you can do is in the chat box, maybe you can just write down the phrase, it is a truth, and just tell us, what are the associations from it. Okay.
Pratyusha is requesting you to repeat the question, Shine, if you could.
Yeah, so the question is, can you, keeping the three questions in mind, so let me sort of just, put the questions on chat. Yeah. So keeping these three questions in mind, sorry. Can you read the sentence and just point out your observations? Whatever, it doesn't have to be for the whole sentence, maybe one part of the sentence. If some of you are more comfortable speaking, do raise your hand and then you can speak also.
I can't really see the hand raising option, so I'm just going to speak. So I'll
Go ahead.
apologize for that first, abruptly speaking. So some observations of this sentence. First of all, this sentence kind of shows the illogical misconceptions of society that they had and they still have. And then if we see it a bit deeper, we can see the intrusiveness and the collectivism of society into an individual's life. So these are my two observations of this sentence.
Okay, but Gopal, you sort of went to the last step. I'm asking you to do the first step, right? You talked about your overall picture of the sentence and what it shows you. I'm saying that this judgment that you formed how do each element of the sentence give you the clue for that? So for example, let's see some of the responses people have given, right? Having money is equated with seeking companionship. That's a very good point, right? That a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. So there is a certain correlation that has been formed here. And from that, you may ask the question, why is there a correlation? And from there, you probably understand that the correlation has to do with perhaps a certain social structure and a certain time. Yeah, Dr. Preeti, you want to say something?
I'm so sorry, since you were already saying something, you may go ahead and then I'll speak, if that's okay. Since you're already speaking.
No, so that was my point. Now go ahead.
All right. So since it says it's a truth, truth means it's, of course, universally acceptable and well acknowledged, and it has some proven, lineage attached to it, that somebody who's a bachelor, a single man here represents a bachelor in possession of a good fortune, somebody who was born, either born with a silver spoon or is affluent enough, could be his own hard-earned money, could be because of the lineage that he belongs to. And in whichever manner, if he's rich enough, he must be in want. Now, want here says that he deserves to get a wife because he has money. He has all the money, and now he deserves to get a wife. And wife here does not or may not refer to a life partner, as I wrote in the chat, for the only reason that, semantically speaking, a life partner could be somebody who's sharing the status with you, socio-cultural or socio-economic status. But when you say wife, she's somebody who, again, it could be a bias, but I don't know, but this is how I interpret it as. A wife is somebody who's going to be subservient to you.
Okay.
Yeah, so that was it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that, Dr. Preeti. And I also want to say something, a couple of things here, that let's look at the word truth, right? So it is a truth universally acknowledged. So it's almost as if, as for the reader, you have to believe that, okay, this is the case. It's already being stated and announced as the truth. But this truth, it says universally acknowledged, is also located in a time and space. It's the truth or a truism of a certain time and space. So that's sort of one of the questions you will ask. The other question you might ask is, why is it a truth? Because perhaps it's rampant. Perhaps this is how it happens. Also taking from what has been said, that the correlation between in possession of a good fortune and must be want for wife, you might think that, okay, then what is the function of the wife here, right? Just by looking at this correlation at the sentence level, you think that, is there a correlation between a wife and fortune?
If I may say, as you already said, that probably it is with respect to a specific time and location. Yes, indeed, there was a time, and I do not know whether we agree to the fact FACT or not, but then even till date, we do look for stability. As a girl would always look for stability, no matter how much we deny the fact, but then stability does come in mind. Okay. So it's not only love. Now the stability could be different for different people. We have different perspectives to look at it. Maybe if somebody is well qualified, I could consider him to be a stable man, and I could woo him or I could marry him. Okay. Not necessarily somebody who has all the wealth. Okay. Thank you for that. Thank you. Yeah, Unnati, you want to say something?
Yes. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yes, I just had to say that before we, further stretch this conversation between a man and a woman, I think the truth that we're talking about here is so heteronormative in its approach. Now that we look it from an angle differently, that a single man would be wanting a wife.
Okay, so this is also important, that it is a truth that dash, right? And then the truth is stated. But depending on what that truth is, so for example, if it was said, it is a truth that a woman in possession of a good fortune wants to start a writing career, right? So would we think of that as heteronormative? We might think of that, perhaps in terms of how class privilege enables writing careers, right? But based on what the truth is, you sort of make that association, right? Vanshika said that it is a truth universally acknowledged also shows that author demands the reader to believe in it and leaves very little space to deny or reject it. That's a very important point. And here the words universally acknowledged come into play, right? So the author is not just saying it is a truth. It is not just any, let's say unstable or, trivial truth that you can dismiss. It is universally acknowledged. There's an action word here. Everyone acknowledges it. And as a reader, it's like, okay, even I acknowledge it. The reader has drawn me into it, right? All right, so there are many more sort of comments, but what I just wanted to point out is before you arrive at the sort of, broader judgment, which you are from reading the sentence, literary analysis means you have to show how each element of the sentence, and then when we scale it up, the text, helps you sort of develop and argue for that judgment, right? So somebody said trophy wife, right? So this whole idea of a trophy wife is something that is sort of coming from the sentence structure itself, in how the sentence correlation has happened. Right? Now, we were talking about a sentence so far, right? And we saw how just closely observing a sentence can help us build sort of larger analysis, but also it helps us build concrete analysis. Because our point is not to just read a sentence, get a broad picture and make a judgment. We have to show how each element of the sentence sort of verifies our judgment. But of course, a sentence is not enough evidence, right? So when we are analyzing a text, we are looking at multiple sentences. So then the next thing we start doing is to identify patterns. And we start thinking about how what we see in one sentence can be perhaps seen in other sentences, right? Also, one of the ways in which we conduct analysis, and here, let's go back to what we were talking about initially, right? Analysis as examination, breaking down, and so on and so forth. Analysis happens by asking questions. So we took a sentence and we were asking questions, but it also happens by identifying patterns. So first, let's sort of get a broader picture of that before we move into reading a paragraph. So patterns are everywhere, right? And I would suggest that in order to get better at looking at patterns in a paragraph, we have to think of patterns in everyday life. Now, as we know, a word, I'm sure some of you have heard the word signifier, right? We say, oh, this is a signifier. This word is a signifier. Signifier would refer to a sound and an image, right? That's the sort of literal definition, right? A sound image. So we are thinking of patterns visually, right? Maybe the same words are being used. So let's say we see similar words like black dress, green grass, blue sky. These are similar phrases because, black dress, green grass, these are very basic functional adjectives being used, right? Black dress, green grass, blue sky. But let's say if we said terribly black dress, obnoxiously green grass, and blue sky, then we think that blue sky is a little out of place here, right? Because the previous two perhaps are part of a more consistent pattern. So one is we think of them visually, but we also think of them in terms of sound, right? Now, I want to take like maybe just 2 minutes here because I feel like music and noticing patterns in music actually has a lot to teach us about how to look at language and read language. So for example, let's think of a song that everybody knows, Happy Birthday to You. So if you just read it at the level of language, you think that there's a pattern, happy birthday to you, happy birthday to you, happy birthday dear, happy birthday to you, right? So it repeats lyrically. So it's a very simple pattern which repeats in terms of a sentence. Now, you may not know how to read music. That doesn't matter. But I'll tell you that even if you don't know how to read music, you can notice something visually. You notice that when we look at happy, so these are what we call notes, right? You see that they're at the same level, right? They're at the same level. There's a dash, they're at the same level. Again, you see the next happy at the same level, right? You see the next happy at the same level, right? Now, musically, what that means is it is the same note. So you would say happy, right? So when you're singing happy birthday, right? You would say happy. happy, happy, right? You're singing the same note repeatedly. And of course, and Preethia said it's at a lower pitch also. So we'll say happy, we'll sing at a lower pitch, maybe happy. But it's similar to what we were doing with language. Now we want to understand, does this pattern have some emotional association? Does it have some aesthetic effect, right? So what is the difference between, let's say, happy, happy, and happy, happy? What is the difference? Now, one pattern could be that, or one meaning of that happy could be that it's almost like speaking, right? So you're saying happy. So it's like it's grounded, right? It's grounded. You're not, sort of, it's not a very contrasting emotion, right? It's a very grounded emotion, like happy, not happy, right? Now you notice, so that's just a one pattern we notice. Let's say then we look at sort of a broader pattern, happy birthday to you. Now we notice that if you just follow it visually, you will see that for this part, happy birthday, first part, second part and third part, there's a similar kind of movement in terms of how these notes are moving. So it's going up, then going down, then coming down, going up, going down. But in the last happy, it starts from up. Now, when you sing it, what you hear, you sing it like happy birthday to you, happy birthday to you, happy birthday to you, happy, right? So the last one is like coming from above. Now, if I have to think that what is the pattern here? The pattern here is that the first three happy birthday to you is following an ascending movement, right? So that is the pattern. There are three ascending movements followed by a descending movement. But why is that important? And why is that important for language? It's important for language because, again, there is an aesthetic function here. When I'm speaking, if I keep speaking by ascending constantly, right? So if I keep speaking in an ascending way and then I go up 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 and then I go up, at some point you'll feel like, okay, where does this end? You're building tension, but you're not giving release. So I'll go up, up, up and come down, right? So I remember somebody initially had said that, okay, the sentence may anticipate something. Similarly, when we look at language patterns, sometimes the patterns anticipate something that will come later. You're already expecting it. Now, with some of these thoughts in mind, let's move to looking at patterns in language. So first, let's sort of take like a minute to think about this paragraph. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal. Thank you very much. They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. Mr. Dursley was the director of a firm called Grunnings, which made drills. He was a big, beefy man with hardly any neck, although he did have a very large mustache. Mrs. Dursley was thin and blonde and had nearly twice the usual amount of neck, which came in very useful as she spent so much of her time craning over garden fences, spying on the neighbors. The Dursleys had a small son called Dudley, and in their opinion, there was no finer boy anywhere. Now, what I want you to do, and it might feel a little difficult initially, but I want you to just observe this paragraph and start identifying patterns. Now, these patterns may be at the level of similar words. These patterns may be at the level of similar types of phrases. They have a similar function, right? So when we looked at thank you very much, is there another phrase like thank you very much? Let's try to notice that. So can we do this? Take a minute and tell me what are some of the patterns. I'll tell you one to begin with, which is simply Mr. and Mrs. Dursley, Mr. Dursley, Mrs. Dursley, and the Dursleys. So you find that just in like a paragraph, this is in fact two paragraphs, one short and one slightly longer paragraph in the book. You find that Mr. Mrs. Dursley and the Dursleys, the idea of them as a unit, as a married couple, that's been established a few times. So that's one pattern. What about other patterns? Can you notice? Okay, Rosemary has said they were perfectly normal. Thank you very much. They just didn't hold with such nonsense. And in their opinion, there was no final boy anywhere. All signify arrogance, superiority, and egotism. Okay. But would you say that they immediately sort of signify arrogance and superiority? Or they are just sort of, so before we get to the social and emotional associations, can we just find out what is it? What is the pattern, if you have to label it? Like, is it an intensifier? Is it a reinforcement? Assertiveness, okay. Gopal has said, big beefy man with hardly any neck, thin blonde with twice the amount of neck. Great. So that's one pattern we find. What is this pattern? This is a pattern of physical description. But there is something more to this pattern, right? It's not just big beefy man with hardly any neck. So there's some sort of a contrast. So there is a physical description with a contrast, which is emphasized. Thin blonde with twice the amount of neck. So you're given a contrasting image almost, right? Hadia said crude caricatures, but before we can say confidently it's a crude caricature, we have to first identify what the pattern is. Now the question is, when this physical contrast is provided, big beefy man with hardly any neck, is that a caricature? Is that feeding into a social stereotype? Is that fat phobic, right? Is it biased against fat people? Aishwarya has said perfectly normal, stranger, mysterious. This is also interesting. If you notice that perfectly normal, and you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious, it's almost like they are trying to show that, oh, we are distinct, right? So there is a defensive or, you know, they really want to establish that they're normal, that they are very distinct from what is abnormal, right? So this pattern perhaps shows that. Gopal, you want to say something?
Yes, I would like to say something. Again, this might be far-fetched, as was my problem with analysis. But the thing is that the first paragraph, states that they are normal, and they like say it as well, that they were perfectly normal. And if we look at the second paragraph and the question that you asked about stereotypes, are they feeding into the stereotypes? So if you look at a lot of like advertisements from 50s, 60s, and up till the 90s, I guess, of a nuclear family, of a couple and their child. So if we look at that, and then we look at this paragraph that, describes them, so we can see clear similarities, like they are strengthening their point that they are actually normal, and what society thinks is a nuclear family and what people think is a family, they are that.
So Gopal, what if I tell you this judgment can be made using 3 patterns? One pattern is the pattern of presenting Mr. and Mrs. Dursley as one unit. And this pattern you find by looking at Mr. and Mrs. Dursley, Mr. Dursley, Mrs. Dursley, the Dursleys, right? So these 4 phrases constitute that pattern. Second pattern, through perfectly normal, thank you very much, that assertiveness or defensiveness about their normal. You don't expect them to be involved in anything strange or mysterious. There is a sort of reinforcement of normalcy, right? And a third pattern we can say is things like number 4 Privet Drive. Director of a firm called Grunnings, then which came in useful when she spent her time craning over garden fences. So you are getting a sense of the spaces they live and work within. And using these 3 patterns, perhaps now you can put together that judgment. Does that make sense, Gopal? Right? So
yes.
What I'm trying to say is that before sort of jumping to the conclusion, which we are getting, which we're intuiting, let's think of how these patterns come together to show you that. Now, let me sort of, SB, would you like to say something?
Yeah, hi, this is Shweta. That's SB. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, as you have already spoke about it, I find it really very interesting. The first paragraph very clearly is assertive. I find it assertive and is defensively asserting some information that whatever the query is being raised, this is pertaining to that answer, that yes, they are normal. There is no need to even anticipate that something of whatever the query is about can be expected from this couple. And the second paragraph only reinforces the idea of what a perfect family like Mr. Dursley in all forms, socio-economic, political, power forms, will anyway not do what is expected or what is being said that they might have done. So be it talking about their position like director of the firm, then asserting his physical attributes like, oh, he's not just director as an intellectual power, but he's masculinity too. Then again adding Mrs. Dursley's feminine characters, which are very much socially accepted, that she's a perfect thin blonde woman, a perfect wife, and they have a perfect family. That they have a son, not a daughter, but a perfect Dudley son, and typically accepted name, it seems. So everything is perfect. So there is no need to even think about something like that. So I mean that these are the patterns that I see, that perfection and defensiveness.
Great. And I think like we can, as we keep observing and keep listening to each other, we'll begin to see so many patterns. Now, I want to sort of, but Shweta, thanks for that. I think you also summed up a lot of points. But I want to now just reinforce the point that what we are trying to do is not just, arrive at our judgment, but have a grounded understanding, right? At a grounded analysis. And what is the ground? The sentences and the phrases, which show us the pattern. So one style that I use sometimes is to, let's say, do color coding, just to understand what are some similar phrases, and then sort of put down the function of each. So let's say Mr. and Mrs. Dursley, Mr. Dursley, Mrs. Dursley. So I said presented as one unit. Also, they're impersonally named. I'm thinking, okay, is this establishing distance from the reader? You're not being allowed to empathize with them, perhaps. Then perfectly normal, last people you'd expect to be involved in anything. Then you're also asking questions like, why are they defensive, right? Why do they not want to be involved? And also, is this anticipating something, right? Is a strange or mysterious going to come in the next paragraph? Because they're like, oh, I don't want anything strange. There's so many, let's say, horror stories which will begin with that premise, with that starting point. You're not expecting any horror, and so it happens, right? Hardly any neck, although he did have a very large mustache. So there are physical contrasts. Is this evoking social stereotypes? All of these questions can become research questions, right? Then the next step is where we start understanding, okay, this is our intuition. Now, as Gopal was saying, you're making him think of, how couples have been represented in middle-class neighborhoods, let's say. But then we need to sort of read up on it. But now we have the clues through which we do it. And finally, thank you very much. They just didn't hold with such nonsense. This is a pattern, which is also a stylistic pattern. This is a style in which the author writes. So this also becomes part of a literary analysis. That the use of intensifier, and perhaps if we read more of the text, we start noticing, yeah, this is how the author rhetorically or linguistically shows us the meaning. This is how the author makes us feel, right? That there are moments where the author is showing us that these characters are close the conversation, right? There's an absolute assertion, and the author does it by using these phrases. Now, the next thing we'll do is to sort of think of now we start noticing patterns in, let's say, one paragraph. But using this method, we start noticing patterns in other paragraphs too, in other texts. And this is useful because this brings us to our next method of analysis, which is by comparison. So first I will demonstrate and show you this, also because we don't have much time and we have to move on to another exercise. So this is a paragraph, so let me first read it. We were in study hall when the headmaster entered, followed by a new boy dressed in regular clothes and a school servant carrying a large desk. Those who were sleeping woke up and everyone rose as though taken by surprise while at work. The headmaster motioned us to sit down again, then turning to the study hall teacher, Monsieur Roger, he said to him in a low voice, "Here is a pupil I am entrusting to your care." I'm sorry. He's entering the 5th. If his work and his conduct are deserving, he will be moved up to the seniors as befits his age. Now, unlike the previous paragraph, we notice that this sentence This paragraph is a lot more mild, right? It's a lot more passive. So this paragraph is far more passive in its description. All of those reinforcements and intensifiers, thank you very much, right? No finer by anywhere, none of them are being used. So here we notice other patterns. So let's say one pattern we notice here is how you have a set of events being shown in sequence, right? We were in study hall when the headmaster entered, followed by a new boy. So there is sequential action. Those who were sleeping woke up, right? And everyone rose. So cause and effect. Headmaster motioned us to sit down, then turning to the study hall teacher. So through these sort of words like entered, followed by, those who were sleeping woke up, then turning to, you're being presented this idea of how one action is connected to another action, which is not quite the case for the previous paragraph, right? Second pattern you notice is how some of these, phrases are used. New boy, regular clothes, large desk, low voice. Now these are adjectives, yes, but they don't, they're very functional. Large desk. Now you're imagining, how large is it? Is it so large that, it's overwhelming? Is it not very large compared to, I don't know, what you think is large? Regular clothes. What are regular clothes? Are these, this has to do with perhaps the culture, the class position of the student, but you don't know what they are. So these are very functional descriptions. They're not revealing more. They're also preventing more judgment. And the narrator also, in the previous part, we know that the narrator is also taking a position almost. Here, the narrator is also more distant, right? We find another pattern: headmaster, school servant, right? Study hall teacher. So if I may show you now, that headmaster, school servant, study hall teacher, they're characters in the story, but they're presented in terms of institutional identity. And there is an institutional social hierarchy also, right? By saying headmaster, head, school servant, study hall teacher. So that hierarchy is also established. So these are some of the patterns we find. So in different paragraphs, you find different sets of patterns. And what we now want to try to understand is, let's say the first one was, let's say sample one, where we looked at how characters presented as a family unit, perhaps a sort of middle class unit, defensive about their identity, about their normalcy. But here characters are presented via conventional labels, right? So here it's not said Mr. Dursley was a regular bank manager, right? It says Mr. Dursley is a big beefy man. So here you have emphatic physical descriptions, whereas here you have functional physical descriptions, right? Regular clothes. In the first sample, you have use of intensifier, so providing some glimpse into the characters, right? Here you have a passive or detached tone, right? It's providing a summary of the events. Now, just by contrasting, my question to you is, can we start commenting now on the genre of the texts? By genre, I mean that how would you now classify these paragraphs? Are they satires? Are they romances? Are they, different for sample one and sample two? Are they detective? Are they journalistic? What are they? So from this information, what do you think you would speculate? Authoritative, okay. What do you mean? Which one is authoritative? Sample one is ironic. Okay, good. Sample one is ironic. Sample two is journalistic. Sample two is domineering, but isn't sample two very passive actually? So Subir, could you tell us why you think that's domineering? I would say that just from the patterns we have identified, we don't have that much evidence yet. Sample two is descriptive. Okay.
Hello.
Yeah, yes, Subir.
Yeah, hi. It gives me a sense of this domination because of the social hierarchy which is embedded in the text. When the narrator says that there was a sound and then people woke up. So,
okay, in that sense. So
yeah, in that sense, yes, yes.
Okay, so you can say that sample 2 presents a sense of the social hierarchy.
Yeah, okay, domineering in that sense, yes.
Yeah,
sure.
Sample 1 is not giving you any sense of a social hierarchy. You don't know like
no.
How the Dursleys are in relation to other people. Okay. Sample 2 is descriptive with an emphasis on atmosphere. Now, we don't have that much information at this point, perhaps, right? But we have some basic understandings nonetheless. And as we read on more, we'll try to develop those understandings. Sanskriti said sample 1 might be a detective fiction. There seems to have been a crime that is being investigated. Okay. Yeah, it's possible. Maybe you can say that maybe strange, just that assertion of they're very normal. Maybe there's some defensiveness there. Maybe there's done something which will be, or some disruption will happen. So there's that sense of a mystery, perhaps. Okay. All right, but by identifying the patterns and by putting them down and then contrasting them with other patterns, we begin to get a sense of where we stand, right? We begin to get a sense that this text is more journalistic. It is journalistic because we can contrast it with what is not journalistic, right? With what is bombastic, let's say, with what is a polemic, right? All right. Now, we'll move to the next sort of exercise, which will be our final sort of exercise for this session. And then we'll maybe, if we have 10 minutes, we'll take some questions. So now we come back to what we had started with, which is okay. Now we have asked some questions of a sentence. We have, anticipated some themes, perhaps by looking at elements in the sentence. Then we have moved on to identifying patterns in a paragraph, right? And by identifying those patterns and then contrasting them with other patterns, we have a sense of some of the, let's say, the characteristics of the text of the paragraph. But now we have to write it down. We have to produce an analysis. One of the things many of you said is that you are somehow struggling to structure, right? Put it together, connect. Now, one of the methods, and I'll only say one, but for this workshop, we're going to use this method, that one of the templates in which we logically present an analysis is through an argument, right? What does that mean? An argument helps justify our judgments about the text with careful reasoning, right? We have reasons to support our judgment, but also we can identify the loopholes and gaps. Perhaps the reasons are not good enough, right? Now, to understand this more, let's think of what an argument exactly is. So let me just put down your responses on chat box. I'll give you some sentences, right? And I want you to tell me if you think they're arguments or not. So suppose I say, I love analysis. Is that an argument? Just yes or no, whatever. No, it's not an argument. So this is an emphatic no, right? I love analysis is not an argument. It is a statement, right? It is an assertion. Yes, it's a statement. And it's not supported by reason. So it's at the level of opinion. Now, if I say I love analysis because it mentally stimulates me, is that an argument? Yes or no? Yes, it's an argument because I've given a reason, right? Now, what if I say I love analysis because it mentally stimulates me and because I love chicken? Is that an argument? But
and because you love?
And because I love eating chicken.
Oh.
Now, but the thing is this an argument? This is actually an argument because I have given an assertion with a reason, but there's another problem with it. So what is the problem? It's not a coherent argument, right? There's a logical fallacy. So the reason, eating chicken has nothing to do with analysis. Like, how is this connected? And even if this is connected, you have to prove, right? So I have to prove that. Now, keeping that in mind, right? Let's think of structure, what the structure of an argument is. No, now the structure of an argument can be understood in two forms usually. One is a claim supported by reason or a conclusion supported by premises. Now for this workshop, I'm going to use the second definition. It's the same really because, premises are also reasons, which are supporting the conclusion of the claim, right? If I write it the other way, reasons justifying the claim or premise leading toward a conclusion. Now, let's say I say this, and this is an online workshop, so it's a meta kind of moment. I find it difficult to focus during online classes because of an unstable internet connection. Family members, or let's say this is grammatically actually odd, because of an unstable internet connection, because family members keep walking and talking around me, and a constantly buzzing phone, right? Let's say these are three reasons or premises. Now, there are multiple reasons this is an argument. But do you think, are you satisfied with it? Do you think it's persuasive? Now, it's a valid argument. It's not illogical. But is there something missing here? So Tanushree, you have said, no, it's not persuasive. Can you tell us? You can speak also if that's comfortable.
I mean, there's no connection. I mean,
okay.
It's just it seems like excuse, right?
Okay, so okay, excuses. So these are excuses, but these are reasons nonetheless. Now the problem is that when you are presenting an argument to another community, they don't intuitively understand why the reasons are valid or good. If I'm telling it to my friend, he understands, yeah, you have an unstable internet connection, even I have it, I get it, I get why, but somebody else doesn't get it. So here again, we ask a question, because of an unstable internet connection, but why does an unstable internet connection affect online classes? Now, this is what we call descriptively mapping premises, right? So what are the premises here? The premises here are that internet connection is unstable, family members keep walking, and my phone keeps buzzing. Now, if I have to ask you, why do you think an unstable internet connection makes you lose your focus? What would you say? Can you describe that problem a little more? Okay, breaks the flow. Is that it? Okay, rejoining again is a hassle. Good. You miss points because, you lose context, okay? And you don't know what's being said, why it's being said. The consistency is gone, yes. It's a distraction because, it's suddenly off and then you come back. All right, so now what we are doing here is that we are taking this premise, let's say one premise is unstable internet connection, but we are sort of, developing it further. We're describing it further. And the more we are able to describe it, the stronger it will be as a reason. Right? Now, what I have written down, somebody has said disoriented, irritation, add stress, right? So all of these different elements will go into it. Now, this is what I will encourage you, is a great method to approach argumentation when you're writing your answers and when you're presenting your analysis. Think of what the premises are and how much you need to describe the premises. So just to talk about the, internet example. So let's say one premise is internet connection is unstable. So I get disconnected from the meeting sometimes and I miss hearing some parts of the lecture. Thus, I'm not able to connect different parts of the lecture. Family members keep walking without announcing themselves. So it's difficult to listen to what the teacher is saying. Phone keeps buzzing. Since I have to do the class on phone, it keeps interrupting my concentration. Maybe I should keep my notifications off. Now here you see there's a reflection, right? I'm thinking maybe I should keep it off, but I have this urge to check my messages constantly. And as a result, I find it difficult to focus. By describing the premises, you have created a far stronger grounding for your conclusion. So the reader is feeling more persuaded, more satisfied, and more stimulated also, right? Thinking more about what you have to say. Now, keeping that in mind, let's do this exercise. Now, the question simply is, do you think in this sort of presentation of the argument, the premises, and there's only one premise though, justify the conclusion in this argument, right? So what is the premise here? Premise here is that exaggerated contrasts of physical features, big beefy man with hardly any neck, are used to describe both Mr. Dursley and Mrs. Dursley. And the conclusion is that the text invokes negative social stereotypes associated with fat bodies to caricature Mr. Dursley and Mrs. Dursley. Now, is this persuasive? Are the premises enough? Or do you think there's missing information? Or there's some disconnect? Gopal, you're saying this is enough, like this justifies, all right? Anybody else? Read it carefully, read it closely. Do you think that the information we are getting in the premises is enough to justify the conclusion? So Vanshika, you said no. Could you explain? And others, you could also put it down on chat. Why you, if you think it's not, why?
It is not persuasive because it is just describing that the physical features are associated to Mr. and Mrs. Dursley, but it does not explain that they are invoking any negative sort of association with body types.
Okay, so the negative association is something that may not be completely clear from this, right? It's not that the author has said something negative about them. The author has given a description. Now, if you think that these are negative stereotypes, right? If you think that the author is living in a society where all of us associate, a big beefy man with hardly any neck to be somehow negative, then it is a negative description. But just from the text, we don't know, right, adequately. Anything else? Is that it? My next question is, do you think that, okay, Hadia said mere physical features won't do justice to the analysis. All right. I think it's not enough as it needs more points. Let's say with their personality affected by their body type. All right, that's a good point, right? So just from this premise, we don't know what is the narrator's judgment of their personality. So as a result, we can't perhaps jump to this conclusion yet. Also, it says the text invokes negative social stereotypes associated with fat bodies to caricature both Mr. Dursley and Mrs. Dursley. But if you think of Mrs. Dursley's description, is it fat? It says was thin and blonde and had nearly twice the usual amount of neck. Is this a description of a fat body? It's not, right? So once you start sort of looking closely, you realize, no, wait, Mr. Dursley and Mrs. Dursley are described a little differently. So it's not that it's not that they're fat shamed. If they are, it's not that they are negatively stereotyped as fat in the same way. Because here, Mrs. Dursley is not really described as a fat body. Instead, what you see here is a contrast. Yeah, Abdul, you want to say something? Okay, I thought you were speaking. Yeah. Now, anything else? Now, the point is that if you're not sort of, describing your premise very closely, you will start missing details. And if you start missing details, your conclusion is going to be a little imprecise, right? It's not going to be strong enough. Now, what would happen if we start describing the premise better? So let me sort of go step by step here. Mr. Dursley is described as big and beefy. Now, when we think of the meaning of big and beefy, it's giving the dual sense of him being both large-sized, right? So big, large-sized, but beefy has an association with being muscular, right? Which could also have a positive association, let's say, right? We know about these strongman contests, weightlifters, they are also big and beefy, right? So if, let's say, big and beefy is negative here, we don't know yet. There's an additional detail, right? Along with big and beefy, there's the additional detail of him hardly having a neck. Now, what does this do? This contrasts with a symmetrical image of a muscular body. So this is something you can point out. You can say that there is a quote unquote symmetrical image of a muscular body, which is premised on what we call, let's say, an ableist or an able-bodied assumption that, okay, this is how a body needs to be. You must have this length of neck. But if you think of the contrast that is being mentioned, the contrast is actually between the large mustache and the lack of a neck. The author is not contrasting anything else. The author is contrasting hardly any neck, although he had a large mustache. Now you would think, okay, what does that mean? Once the author has showed it to us as a contrast, should we read it as visually odd? And then should we stretch it and read the whole body as visually odd or disagreeable? Now, as you're mapping the premise, what you realize is that you can't clearly jump to a decisive conclusion, right? But you get a clue, and this is a clue for research. And the clue is that you have to look at how big male bodies are represented in popular culture. So you look at, let's say, this text, now I can announce it, it's, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, and the first book in the Harry Potter series. And you would think that, okay, in that tradition of writing, young adult literature, fantasy literature, in, let's say, literature in Britain coming out in the 20th century, how are big male bodies usually represented? Can you find some research on it? And from there, you can start making a judgment, right? So, and the final point that I want to make is that, we talked about some tools, right? So let's zoom out and think of these tools, because ultimately at the end of this workshop, what you're left with are these tools that you can use in other, spaces to analyze text as well as analyze other things, So asking questions, asking the what question, very importantly, it's the fundamental question, and then followed by how and why, right? Identifying patterns. And once you sort of ask questions and start looking at elements in a sentence, then you start looking at how they play out in a longer body of text. Identifying contrasts to distinguish one type of text from another type of text, right? Let's say a thriller from, a dry journalistic work. And descriptive mapping. And the mapping helps you sort of lay down the premises and the sort of ground on the basis of which you can. And along with that, the final thing to think about is that these tools that we are selecting, this happening through our own interests and biases, right? So when you're asking a question, you're asking some questions, not other questions, right? When you're identifying patterns, there's some patterns you're interested in, not other patterns. So it's important to note that and reflect on that. And it's important to also then listen. And I think the good thing about the workshop is we got so many different answers. So it just, makes your mind kind of think through what other people are saying. So it's also very important to reflect on our biases as a result. All right, so that's sort of the overall presentation. And if you have any questions, we'll take some questions now. Thank you.
Sayan?
Yeah.
I had a small question. I think I pointed out that question earlier, which is about imprecision when we are trying to express anything, even verbally, not just in terms of writing, but also verbally. I think a large part of it comes from the fact that the language in which you have been trained becomes a hindrance or also facilitates. So in my case, I'm from Bihar and currently located in Bangalore. And since I had some good school education and college, I can express myself, but there are times when it becomes a hurdle. It becomes really difficult to clearly express yourself, and it happens in many languages. It is not just in terms of English or in terms of Hindi. But that imprecision, one of the reasons is, of course, this vernacularization of language. And second one is also that there are things which you really can't express.
So let me sort of address this question by first talking about the last thing. There are some things you can't express, right?
Yeah.
It's so difficult. Now, what we are trying to find is some approximation, right?
Yeah.
We're trying to find a close fit for that.
Right.
But one thing that we are trying to get good at. So as soon as we ask the question, we look at a sentence and we say, what is this part of a sentence? Right? Now, one of the things you could do is you could just search on Google, what are the parts of a sentence?
Right.
And you get introduced to a vocabulary of grammar. Now, you may have read it in school, but you never sort of thought of like how it would actually be powerful at some point. And you start realizing, okay, something is called a subject, something is called a qualifier, something is called an intensifier,
right?
Something is called a metaphor, right?
Right.
So by sort of finding those words, you sort of start getting an insight into what the function is. So I said it's an intensifier. But if I hadn't said it, you might think, how do we label it? How do we label thank you very much? Right? But what you can understand is that thank you very much has a function. So even in your imprecise language, try to spell it out. What is thank you very much doing? Some of you did that. Right? And once you start spelling it out, you start realizing, can I find a more accurate category for this? Can I find like a label for this? So that's I think the process in which you do it. In the attempt to label, you have to then read, look up, think more, work through language, and find sort of the right words.
So can I ask an associated question, which is about, can there be situations where it really becomes difficult? Even you might be a good scholar or a writer or an author. Do you also face the situation, this hurdle of expressing them in the most precise manner?
Yeah.
Because I'm sure there would be situations where you are feeling something, but it is not coming out in your painting or in your words or in your music as much as it should have.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that one of the things that we do, and this is why, I said one question to ask is, what are your interests and biases?
Yeah.
But what that means is you are reflecting on your choices and process. Now, suppose you find that, okay, I'm able to approximate, I'm able to, say something, but it doesn't feel precise.
Yeah.
But having that reflection, you can now point it out. Even in your analysis, sometimes you can say that, okay, these are the limitations. Perhaps I used a word that needs to be developed. And you are humble enough to state it so that somebody now takes that up, right?
Yeah.
So that frequently happens in a lot of, critical work where the limitations of certain categories also point out. Yeah, Vanshika, Gopal, could you ask your questions? Yeah.
Yes, sir. So, sir, like we concluded that we should understand our biases, like we should acknowledge our biases. So the question is that after acknowledging our biases, that this is how we think, should we write something based on any text, based on our biases, or we should try to be neutral and see what we haven't looked forward?
So I think first, so what we are focusing on today is the reading aspect of it, right? Before we get to the writing. So at the reading level, if you start identifying the bias, right? So let's say, Gopal was saying that, or when we were talking about the, fat, this bias that you have, that this is referring to fat stereotypes. Now, with that bias in mind, you will miss a detail, perhaps. Now, if you recognize this could be a bias, so let me look at it again. Let me read the details again. So then through reading the details, you're able to sort of understand that maybe your bias is not justifiable completely, right? Second, you realize, okay, maybe I need to read more. So by acknowledging your bias, you realize what else you need to do. Now, after having, let's say, read, a couple of essays, talked to a few people, looked at more details, you realize, no, my bias is actually correct, or my bias has a justification. Then present it. But do it after going through the reading carefully. Right? That's all I'm saying. Right? Don't jump. Right? Be grounded. Yeah.
All right, sir. Thank you.
Gopal?
So my question is that whenever we are doing analysis and you have like explained it, how, link it properly, how to structure it properly so that, the conclusion is supported enough by the premises. The thing is that when we are analyzing, we kind of get excited. Oh my God, we're going in deep. So what happens is that sometimes, you notice some things that have weaker links or weaker evidences or very like minute evidences, but you still like want to mention them. Although like strong evidence based conclusions should be to the forefront, but you still, want to mention those in your analysis. So how do we safely approach this problem, because there are a lot of people who get kind of critical over these like unsupported conclusions.
So I think, and I'll combine this with Sonali's question, that while writing the analysis of a novel, should we mention all the premises or just a few will do? I think, again, the focus is on the reading here. So when we are reading and thinking about a text, and I hope that now when you sort of go back and read any sentence, you're thinking more about each of the elements. At the reading level, there are a lot of like information that you get. But when you start writing, it may be you may actually want to focus on perhaps the stronger evidences and not a premise or not an evidence which distracts you a little bit. Or let's say you look at all the premises, right? So what Sonali is saying, you look at all the premises, you think it out in a detailed manner, but you have to write a 500-word assignment. So then you have to prioritize. But I would say at the reading level, you try to be as detailed as possible in your thinking, in your identification. But at the writing level, there are choices you will make depending on what is expected, right? You don't want to distract the reader with so much information that it's overwhelming. Or if it's a short assignment, you have to prioritize which premises or reasons you need to provide.